Hi, I'm Fred Burton.
And I'm Matthew Bay.
We're here today to discuss our new podcast, Essential Geopolitics. In about 10 minutes, you'll get insight on what's happening behind the headlines, a dose of essential intelligence to keep you ahead of the news. Matthew, let's talk about Iran. How has the U.S. and Iran relationships gotten to where we are today?
Yeah, so when President Trump was elected in 2016, he campaigned on the idea that he wanted to tear up the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal that was signed between President Obama and Iran, and obviously the other members of the permanent members of the UNSC Council. Since then, Trump has essentially taken the knife in the gutting of the JCPOA into the sense of increasing sanctions on Iran several times. So, for example, in May of last year, President Trump, after negotiating with the Europeans, trying to get the Europeans to take a more hardline approach to Iran, pulled out of the JCPOA, announced that he was going to snap back on sanctions on Iran. They started with that process in August of last year.
How's that going to play out in 2020, though?
In 2020, we've already seen Iran starting an aggressive strategy to respond to that. So, for example, in May of this year, Iran announced that they were going to start reducing their commitments to the JCPOA and basically match step with the United States. Since then, we've seen Iran conducting, or at least Iranian proxies or attacks linked to Iran, conduct against oil infrastructure in the region. So, for example, we had the attack on Saudi Arabia's oil industry in September that took off basically half of Saudi Arabia's oil production for a couple of weeks, perhaps doing them themselves. Now, obviously, there's no smoking gun that we have linking Iran to being directly behind some of the attacks, like the attacks on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq and Kuwairis oil facilities in September. But that strategy is clearly designed to increase the cost of the United States maintaining structure or sanctions on Iran. Next year, we would expect those attacks to continue. They may not necessarily be at the same scope or pace that we've seen this year, particularly over the summer when we were seeing one roughly every single month, for example.
They seem to have slowed down a little bit.
They have. We haven't seen one since Abqaiq, and one of the reasons for that is Iran might have assessed that they went too far. After that, Europe took a much more hardline stance on Iran's ballistic missile program, saying that that needed to be included in any discussions down the road, which Iran never wanted. The Europeans had been previously focused on the nuclear issue itself.
What's the Saudis done in response to this?
Saudi Arabia, in response to this, has started to even negotiate and reach out with the Houthis in Yemen, for example. They've been in a war in Yemen for the last 5 years. The idea being there is that they view them as Iranian proxies, essentially, but if they can negotiate a settlement in Yemen, they can then redistribute some of their attention to their northern border, the northeastern border with Iran. Now, as we look forward to 2020, we expect Iran to take a more aggressive strategy in its response to the U.S., mainly, though, in the nuclear element, in the sense of increasing their activities. They've already been doing that roughly every 60 days since May, when they announced that they were going to start reducing their JCPOA commitments. We even expect or could see their strategy this year go to the point where they might leave the JCPOA entirely. That would put the Europeans in a very difficult spot.
And you raise an interesting point there. What is the European play here?
So Europe has been trying to they've been caught in the middle. So they've been trying to essentially give Iran economic assurances to keep them in the JCPOA. One of Iran's big reasons why they've left the JCPOA entirely, they started to reduce their commitments with the JCPOA, has been because the U.S. sanctions have prevented them from exporting as much oil as they anticipated. The EU has been trying to set up an alternative payment system to allow for Iran to continue to gain some of those financial incentives, essentially, or financial benefits of staying in the JCPOA, but that hasn't worked because the U.S. sanctions are that powerful. Now, on the other hand, they have also been dealing with the idea that even if they set up this alternative payment system, the U.S. sanctions have actually prevented that from being all that useful. And then now, like I mentioned before, the Abqaiq attacks, that's basically put their security interests in the JCPOA. It's broadening that out. They were originally really concerned about focusing any kind of negotiations for sanctions relief really to the one key issue that they care about, which is Iran's nuclear program. Now that Iran has demonstrated the willingness and the capability to use its missile program to affect the world economy, taking off Saudi Arabia's oil production, they're now viewing that in a much more substantial way about how it is something that could affect their security, which is why now they are starting to go into what the U.S. has been pushing them into doing and focusing on Iran's ballistic missile program as something that needs to be negotiated on.
What are you looking for specifically as you watch Iran every day? I know we look at that consistently here at Stratfor. What are some of the tripwires you look for, Matthew?
So one of the things we always are looking for is just the health of the Iranian economy. We don't necessarily think that, if Iran sees massive protests that they're going to overthrow the government, or if Iran sees massive protests, that means they're going to adjust their strategy against the West and oil infrastructure in order to get sanctions off quicker. But it does play into upcoming elections that we do have in Iran. They'll be holding those in February of next year. There'll be parliamentary elections, and we expect Iran's hardliners to probably perform quite well in those elections. They may not necessarily get gain of the parliament. They have a huge uphill battle on that because they largely lost, particularly in places like Tehran, the elections in 2016. But if we do see the hardliners gain a very vocal point in parliament, in Iran's parliament, it has some power in the sense that it's often used as a way to shed light and transparency issues in terms of discussing whatever is happening in Iran politically. If we have a Iranian hardliner-dominated parliament, that would actually give more political cover for Iran's unelected hardliners. So, say, for example, the IRGC, to continue to do more attacks regionally without having the Majlis, so the parliament, opening up investigations into their activities as frequently.
Thank you, Matthew. That was very insightful. For those of you who would like more information about our thoughts on Iran, please visit worldview.stratfor.com. I'm Fred Burton.
And I'm Matthew Bay.